Oh, good evening and welcome to Dusty Feet. It's March 16th, 2023, and we have some more branches on the vine with the Bible Project. We are continuing our series about how to view the Bible, and this is part 5, right? Again, we're going to be using the Bible videos, right, from the Bible Project as our launch point on how to read, right? So we'll continue from there and we'll see where it takes us. So come, join us on TheDustyFeet.com. We've created a space where folks can safely explore and interact, discussing these wonderful scrolls that we call the Bible. We have many different topics for discussion outside the class, Sons of the Father, the Bible Project, Aleph Beta, Follow the Red String, and more. So, lend your ear, then lend your voice. Community that can build and connect. Come in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. Don't forget to subscribe. Click that bell icon if you want a reminder. And as always in the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more branches on the vine with the Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so like we have each week, let's start with addressing these expectations, right? One, this is not a definitive, you shall do this. It is, hopefully, just a way one might opt to look at things. Two, this is a series, so there'll be no one-liners, right? Actually, many episodes with different responses and options. Three, give grace as each person learns more about this wonderful collection of scrolls that we call Scripture, please. And four, again, this will be a series and it builds on itself. But there is an expectation that one would have listened to the previous videos to keep things in context. Remember, we're building here, right? And five, through this series, I will probably have a few points where I have a differing opinion from Tim and John. By no means am I saying that they are wrong. I just have a differing view on some things. But I have nothing but the highest honor and respect for these two and all the work that they do at the Bible Project. Yes? Okay. I also want to continue to remind y'all of the podcast from Rabbi David Foreman and the folks at Aleph Beta, a book like no other, right? Because he too is continuing to remind his audience that these are important elements to really grasp Torah as well, right? But we're not really surprised at all. So, for those interested in the podcast from the rabbi, the link is in the description below. So, all that said, now let's continue the journey with our next video, Biblical Narrative, the Plot. Enjoy.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible, and we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So, narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting, but then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plotline. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take for example the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at this scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning. You'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon in the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements. And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plot line of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus.
So, narrative, right? The plot. Ever really actually stop to think of the Bible as actually having a plot, right? As we've been building with the previous videos that we've identified the three main literary styles in Scripture. We have narrative, poetry, and prose. Prose discourse, right? But now we're ready to dive into the thoughts of the biblical narrative in the context of plots. And by that, we really have a connected series of plots like they show. We have often called them vignettes, right? That's ours. Like Tim and John like to postulate, the scriptures are a unified story. So let's try to use the word plot here that leads to Jesus. Um, Not all the stories will be about Jesus or even seem to mention or address the Messiah. Yet, they are little mini subplots that will be part of the part of the journey that will get us there. So, maybe in a much larger view of this unified story, this plot that leads to the Messiah, um, these different stories are actually a part of the greater story in this way, right? Some of those stories are just calls to adventure. Many of the stories help build the rising tension, right? We have quite a few stories with climax, um, but I'll throw it out there that the choice of word, although not a bad one, it can lead one to believe a positive high rather than that climax can sometimes actually be a very low low, right? And then we have a few of those stories that'll get us to some interesting and discussable resolutions. I believe the word they used as well, right? But each of these stories or the subplots, they have their own elements, um, but yet in the much wider scale, we can maybe see where they begin to fit right in that greater plot development, right? Oh, because we have so many different characters in multiple settings going through series of events throughout many hundreds of years, right? But the plot, the story that leads to the Messiah, right? That needs to develop. Like we mentioned before, and I believe that the plot, this wonderful unified story that leads to Jesus, that is not finished yet. We are just another one of these subplots as them as well, because they're just ready to help us get to the end. Yeah. Hmm. Remember when Tim talked about that great recommendation to put ourselves in the sandals of the characters? So here's an interesting challenge to be in those sandals, making those choices, and then try to grasp, to feel, to relate to the moments in those choices, right? Um, because it might be easier to see ourselves making a different choice, but to try and grasp the choice made might be a bit more challenging, right? So how'd you take the Gideon story? I know for me and my personal background, it was very much an out of context sort of teaching with Gideon. Um, marked as a man testing God, God responding, all is good, right? But now we're introduced to the whole story, not just a scene plucked from a script, right? Context, context, context. So the whole story needs to be taken into account before we can really grasp the depth of this plot. Yeah. So let's stick with the Gideon story for a minute because this is a very good example of plucked out of context type of storytelling. So we get the history up to this point, but we'll go with the Midianites now oppressing the Israelites. So Gideon is commissioned to save the Israelites. Yet he hesitates. He asks God for a sign to know if it was really from him. So so we have doubt, right? So doubts crept in. So remember, we have our sandals on, and we are in ancient Israel at this time, and then this happens, right? A messenger arrives with a word. Uh, Remember, this is not some winged white robe floating angel, or it's a man with a badge and a black suit and a hat, right? This is a messenger from God. He's just camped out under a tree. Gideon, right? He's just busy trying to save his wheat harvest from the invading Midianites, right? And this messenger tells Gideon the message that God gave him to deliver. And he calls Gideon a valiant warrior. But we know with the ensuing conversation and the following stories that, well, that term's put to the test. Yeah. Because Gideon balks. He brings up that he's seen no miracles like the fathers of old, right? Then he asks the messenger to wait while he goes to prepare a sacrifice. He brings it back. The messenger uses his staff and sets fire to the sacrifice. So, Gideon has a sign. End of story. Now we can go and become the instrument of God to deal with the Midianites, right? Well, as we know, and the story continues, we will see a less than valiant behavior, more character development, really. Um, and then we get the scene with the fleece wet, dry, dry, wet. So, really, two more tests. And then Tim and John nail this one in a way that this is much more about when will this guy get his act together and trust God? Okay, but pause. Remember, we're in the sandals. How can we see us in this? Because I'll step up and say it. I'm probably so. Because I'm not sure how I would take a messenger showing up and saying something like that. I agree with the assessment from Tim and John for sure, right? But I want to pause a moment and make sure that judgment does not creep into the assessment as well. Yeah. So God tests back, right? Wait, I thought it was us who asked for tests. God, show me or show us. But again, John and Tim's words seem to ring pretty true here too. So this story is not one about discerning tips into reading God's will, but rather about God's commitment to use even weak people with deep flaws to do more than they personally could have imagined. So in this instance, we have a peek at a single narrative plot with many scenes woven in. Probably more a statement about ourselves than we'd also care to admit. But we really have here is the opportunity to learn from this example is that the entire story is really important. That a scene clipped out, it's not enough. A verse alone will not suffice. Because we will not do the greater story, right? The greater plot any justice by snip and clip and then use that to tell the story. Because I think we might run too great a risk that we'll be maybe somewhere far off in the end, yeah? And that's something to chew on with plots. Think about it. But as I was pondering this, I remembered a beautiful song. And it was by Stephen Curtis Chapman. And it was Not Home Yet. And then one of the verses in the song that's towards the end just came to mind. It said, we're not home yet. So just let us journey on.
We are not home yet. So let us journey.